Hello, welcome back to my kitchen. Today we're doing an Aaron's Baking Corner, and usually for me, baking, I kind of associate with dessert food. And when I was planning this episode, I was thinking to myself, like, well, I want to do an Aaron's Baking Corner, but I don't really want any more dessert because I still have leftover Nanaimo bars, and then I also made ice cream the other day, so I'm like, I don't need more sweets because I don't really eat sweets very quickly. So I was like, I need something that's not sweet, but it's baking related. The main thing that I bake is biscuits, for biscuits and gravy, but I've already done that, so I couldn't do that again. And I was like, well, maybe I'll try some kind of like bread recipe, make a loaf of bread, see how that goes, compare it to the gluten-free bread that I buy. But then it dawned on me, I'm like, ooh, I have a really good like French baguette recipe that I've made a handful of times. And I was actually planning on making some French onion soup this week. So I'm like, that would go great with that. And I'm also gonna make some spaghetti. So I'm like, I can make garlic bread. The stars aligned and I was like, this is what we're doing. This recipe is not super difficult. It's kind of in like this like weird like middle ground because there's a lot of judgment calls that you have to do where it's like, oh, it has to increase in size while it's proofing by 150%. It's like, how do I gauge that? Like, I'm not sitting here with a ruler and being like, is this correct or not? And then also, you know, my struggles with rolling things out. This is gonna involve rolling stuff out, and dough be sticky when it comes to gluten-free, and I don't know why. It's a struggle. One of these days, I'm gonna just keep making myself do this stuff until I understand it and I'm good at it, and then I can move on to some other skill that I'll have to master. But for right now, it's handling dough, making bread, and it's gonna be delicious. Like, I know this is a good one. It's just getting there is, you know, a little bit stressful, a little bit of a struggle at times, but overall, it's not a long recipe either. I mean, there's parts where you have to like wait for stuff to like proof and you have to put something in the refrigerator for a while. The recipe does say that you can do the refrigeration step for 30 minutes to 3 days. So you do have a bit where you can kind of like prep and then make later if the time doesn't work out for you. Obviously, I'm just gonna do it all in one shot, but you can kind of split that up how you need. And the recipe also, like I'm just doing the recipe itself today, but the recipe does say it's a good one to like double the volume of, and then you'd get 4 10-inch loaves instead of what I'm gonna be making today, which is just 2 10-inch loaves, which is still a good bit for one person for a week. Like, unless you're making like a Subway sub kind of thing, it'll take you you know, a few days to go through this. This would also be a good recipe for French toast. I might need to make more bread. All that being said, let's run through the ingredients and then we'll get into cooking. Flour, tapioca flour, yeast, salt, warm water, egg white, honey, apple cider vinegar, butter, and oil. Step kind of like 0, because it's not the first step of the recipe, but it's a step that I need to do because the recipe calls for instant yeast and I have active dry. So the difference there is instant, you can just put it in as like a dry ingredient, whereas active dry, I feel like I've said the wrong words there, but I'll fix it in post. The active dry yeast, that just involves you proofing it, and that just means that you need to put the yeast into some warm water and let it kind of activate itself. So just like a few minutes. So you don't want to add more liquid to the recipe. So I'm just going to take a little bit of the warm water that is required already, put that in with the yeast and let it kind of sit for a few minutes while I prep all the dry ingredients. So for me, the yeast is coming out of the dry ingredients and essentially joining the wet ingredients. Oh, and then the other thing that I almost forgot, with the active dry yeast change, you have to increase the amount of yeast you use. And so this recipe calls for 6 grams of yeast, which is 2 teaspoons. And you're supposed to increase it by, I believe, 125%. So that it essentially turns into 7.5 grams. And the recipe talks about like how to get to that point, which granted, you should be doing baking in grams, but I'm living life on the edge and just doing it by like cups and teaspoons and whatnot. But because it's all weight-based versus like when you're doing volume, things are not as accurate when you're doing volume, especially with like flours and stuff like that. But if we ignore that fact and just focus on the like teaspoon aspect of things, to get to 7.5 is just a half a teaspoon extra. So the 2 teaspoons equals 6 grams. So then, 3 is half of that, so that's 1 tablespoon, and then half of that is 1.5. 6 plus 1.5, 7.5. That's the number that we're going for. And so I'm just putting in 2.5 teaspoons and calling it good. Granted, I'll probably verify that on my scale that I have, but I don't have half a gram. So I don't know if it's 7 or 8. Like, I don't know where in that range it is. But that was just some kind of other good info that you need for this recipe. Or just buy instant yeast and not have to worry about any of this. That's probably a better move. So now, kind of the proper first step is in a stand mixer with a paddle attachment on, we're going to put the dry ingredients in. So for me, that's just the like all-purpose flour that I have, the tapioca flour, and also the salt. And then we're going to turn that on until it's mixed together. And then after it's mixed, we want to form a well and put in all of the wet ingredients. So this is where my yeast will go in. So it's going to be the yeast, in my case, the rest of the warm water, the honey, apple cider vinegar, the butter. Am I forgetting something? The egg white. So now that we have all the ingredients in, the next step is to mix it. And that's going to involve at a low speed, well, not low, I believe the recipe says medium. At a medium speed, kind of mix it together for a minute. And then after a minute, you're going to up it to medium high until it's, I think whipped is the term that they use. I'm gonna need to look all this stuff up before I do it. Whipped and then sticking to the sides of the bowl, which kind of am a little dubious about that because I feel like it's gonna stick right out the gate. But we'll see. There's been a few steps in previous recipes where I'm like, I think this is gonna happen from what the recipe says, and then, I'm like, I was wrong, my bad. Sometimes I'm right. With baking, I'm more likely to trust the recipe than myself, but I feel like it's a sticky dough, but I guess maybe it becomes sticky after mixing it. We'll see. Stay tuned. I mean, you're gonna see it in like 3 seconds. So it's in this weird position where I feel like the mixer, even though it was at like 3, was pretty high. It has like up to 10. So I don't know if I, right out the gate, started mixing it at medium high instead of the medium, because it seemed like it was sticking and light and fluffy like that. Like it didn't seem like I had to do anything to get to that step. But I let it go for a minute, then I increased the speed and then kind of waited a little bit, and then I pulled it off. So the dough's together. The next step is to put that dough into a container that has a lid because you want to make it airtight. And then we're gonna put that in the refrigerator for 30 minutes to 3 days, I believe is the time period that you can store that for. So this is the point where if you want to kind of prep a little bit before actually making it, you can do this and then kind of in the future actually make the bread at a different date, or just wait 30 minutes and then you should be good to go. Next up, we have the somewhat dreaded step of handling the dough, which, I do want to mention the dough itself in the airtight container. I just looked at it. It has increased in volume quite significantly. I forgot that it did that in this step, and I don't think the instructions said anything about that happening. So that's kind of cool. It pretty much like filled up the container I have. You'll see it when I open it up for the next step. But the next step is to obviously coat the surface you're working in flour. And the recipe does say to use the tapioca flour. Don't use the all-purpose flour. Don't really know what effect that will have, but I'm gonna just follow the instructions and use that. So we're gonna dust the whole area because we don't want stuff sticking, and put the dough out, and then we're gonna divide it into two and then roll it into two 10-inch loaves, and hopefully that goes well. So it was very sticky, but I think, the trick is just have flour on hand and it will eventually not be sticky. Hopefully I didn't add too much flour to it, but you live and you learn. The next step is going to be to put those loaves onto a baking sheet that has parchment paper on it, and then we're going to cover with like saran wrap. And it says greased saran wrap, so that's gonna be kind of tricky to do, but grease the saran wrap, or don't. I'm kind of leaning towards don't, or maybe just like put some oil on the baguettes themselves. Because like, how do you grease saran wrap? I don't know. I'm also not a huge fan of saran wrap. It's hard to manage, and then also it just seems like a big amount of plastic that you're wasting. Anywho, that's the next step. And then we're gonna let it proof until it's the whole like 150% of itself. The dough is proofed. It's looking exactly 150%, not 151, not 149, 150. So the next step is to take a sharp knife and cut, I guess like score the top of it at a 45-degree angle, about 1/4 of an inch deep, and you're gonna do 3 of those per loaf. Now the loaves are ready to go in the oven, and the recipe says to throw in some ice cubes when you put in the bread because the steam will help the crust form and give it like a crispy crust. I don't have ice cubes. I don't have an ice cube maker in my freezer, and I just never use ice cubes, so I don't make them. It does say that you can spritz it with water. However, my only spray bottle I use for cleaning, and so I'm not gonna spray my food with that. So my solution is I'm gonna put a little pan with water ahead of time into the oven so that it'll start steaming, because I'm pretty sure like the shock of like the ice cubes on the bottom will just create steam, which there's a term for that, where it just jumps between states. I don't know if it's doing that, but there's a term in my head. I'll put that there. So I'm just gonna kind of put a little bit of water in, and hopefully that will create the steam. It seems like this is what I've done in the past, and it seems to work fine. Obviously, if you have a spray bottle that doesn't have deadly chemicals in it, use that, because that's what the recipe recommends. Mine is a bit of a MacGyver move that hopefully will get the same result. So let's bake those at 475 for 18 minutes. Then we do a half turn for 5 more minutes. And also you have to change up the rack. So like you're putting this at like the very top of the oven instead of like most recipes where you're in like the middle. So here, they're sliding all over the place. But here are the baguettes out of the oven. They need to cool for 10 minutes, and to have a softer crust, it said if you roll them in a tea towel, that should do that. They flattened out a little bit, so I might roll them in a tea towel just because I'm kind of concerned that they are overdone. So I'll catch you in 10 minutes and we will see if I failed at this or not. I promise you, this is a good recipe. I've done it before and it's great. They just don't look a little flat, so I'm worried about that. If you wanna watch, you know, because it's technically a step, but also time is of the essence. So we now have 2 rolled up loaves. Here we are. I mean, from this angle, looks great, beautiful. However, if I turn it, it's flatbread. But I was a little concerned. We did the whole wrapping it in the tea cloth to hopefully soften the crust, and it definitely doesn't feel like a rock like it did when it came out. I did do a little cut, and here's a little nice cross section. I think, ooh, that is being, okay, there it goes. Looks great. I forgot I think the crumb is what it's called. It's solid, it's soft, so it was just the exterior. Even though it's flat, it's not a rock on the inside. And I mean, I've made this before, but I mean, I already have the slice, might as well have a little taste. It's a little, that was a bit much. A little extra virgin olive oil on there. I mean, some pepper and some butter probably would also work well, but yes, please. That, and the great part about having olive oil that you just put on your hands, free hand spa treatment thing. So it's delicious, even though I was a bit worried about it. It worked out. It's all good. It was according to plan. I was never worried. Were you worried? I was cool as a cucumber the entire time. So what else is there to say? Go make some bread. Obviously, this recipe is very gluten-free oriented, but I mean, you can make this gluten-free bread. I don't recommend it because you then have to go buy gluten-free flour. So if you don't have to do that in your life, don't do it because it's expensive. But I want to highly encourage you to try and make your own baguettes. Just go find a recipe, go buy some flour. It's probably way less ingredients. It probably works a lot better. And I want to see some pictures. I want to see some baguettes that people have made, and bonus points if you turn them into French toast. And on that note, bye Mom, still not dead. See ya.